One of the things that makes the pre-Socratic philosophers so fascinating and fun to read is the peculiar blending of mythological and scientific motifs in a really unique mixture that you don't generally find in philosophy. And that's certainly the case with the two philosophers that we're going to be considering in this video, Empedocles and Anaxagoras. There are a number of ways in which Empedocles' philosophy reflects his profoundly religious sensibility, as I would call it. For one thing, he expressed a respect for the gods and a sense of divine justice as a governing force of the universe. For example, in number 6, "Blessed is he who possesses wealth of divine intelligence, but wretched is he, or he is, whose concern is a dim opinion about the gods." And number 7, "There is an oracle of necessity, an ancient decree of the gods, eternal and sealed with broad oaths, that whenever anyone pollutes his own dear limbs with the sin of bloodshed, commits offense and swears a false oath, divinities who possess immensely long life, he wanders away from the blessed ones, thrice 10,000 seasons, through time growing to be all different kinds of mortals, taking difficult paths of life one after another." And then number 8, "Neither then, in this case perhaps, in which one has shed blood, neither then the roofed halls of Aegis-bearing Zeus, nor the house of Hades received him. He's refused both in heaven and in hell." There's a sense of karma and samsara here that sounds like Indian religion, but it's really borrowed from the Pythagoreans. In addition to this, Empedocles apparently thought of himself as a god at one point. In number 1, he says, "I go about among you an immortal god, no longer mortal." He was apparently an admirer of Xenophanes and tried to imitate his verse. He was also, as I just mentioned, an admirer of Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, particularly their religious branch, and he followed them in their doctrine of reincarnation. In one notable way, he presaged Christianity in the delicate balance that he strikes between a pessimistic and an optimistic outlook. Pessimistically, strife is essential to the universe. However, optimistically, so is love. As divided as things are, they nevertheless also have a tendency to come together. Empedocles apparently gave an allegorical interpretation to the gods. This is an approach that became increasingly popular in the Hellenistic world as Greek-speaking intellectuals grappled with the religious and mythological traditions in which they were raised and trying to make sense of them in a way that made them rational. One way to do this was to interpret the gods not literally but allegorically. In that way, one could say that one believes in the gods, but what that meant was that one believed in certain metaphysical principles. And we could say that of Empedocles. He believed in them, but he interpreted them as allegories for his metaphysical principles. For example, number 34, he describes his doctrine of the 4 elements this way. "Hear first the 4 roots of all things, shining Zeus and life-bringing Hera, and Aidoneus, and Nestis, who with her tears gives moisture to the source of mortals." So we have Zeus, who represents fire, the god of lightning. We have life-bringing Hera, who was a goddess of a number of things, marriage, the hearth, but also of the sky, so that represents air. Aidoneus, who was one of the manifestations of Hades. He was a sort of historicized version of Hades, said to be an actual historical king, but it's pretty clear that the story is just a sort of translation of the story of Hades into the reading it into history. And Nestus, who was apparently a Sicilian deity, who is quite clear here is representing water. So you have fire, air, earth, and water. But these are described in terms of gods. Friedrich Nietzsche, in the days when he was a professor of classics, gave a course on the pre-Platonic philosophers, that is, on pre-Socratics and Socrates, in which he described Empedocles as the tragic philosopher. The tragic philosopher. He associated him with Aeschylus, which was high praise. Nietzsche praised Empedocles' distinctively tragic sensibility. Why? Because Empedocles recognized that this world was the product of strife, discord, or opposition. Yet for Empedocles, there was another principle as well, the principle of love. The world has a will to overcome strife. Probably the most important fragment, there are a number that echo it and reflect it, is this one that contains material from the comparatively recently discovered Strasbourg papyrus. That's number 43. Which starts this way. I will tell a double story, for at one time they grew to be only one out of many, but at another they grew apart and to be many of one. This is the great metaphysical story that Empedocles wants to tell, the story of the one and the many. And this cycle in which the one becomes the many and the many becomes the one. We'll return to that. Double is the generation of mortal things, and double their decline. For the coming together of all things gives birth to one, namely generation and decline, and destroys it. And the other is nurtured and flies away when they grow apart again. And these never cease, continually interchanging, at one time all coming together into one by love. Love is the metaphysical principle that draws everything together into one. And in another time, each being borne apart by the hatred of strife. Strife is what divides people into the many. Thus, in that they have learned to grow to be one out of many, and in that they again spring apart as many when the one grows apart. In that way they come to be, and their life is not lasting. But in that they never cease changing continually, and in this way they are always unchanging in a cycle. We can contrast here Empedocles' vision with the Christian story, because it contains interesting similarities and differences. In Christianity, too, there's the principle that God is the great gathering force. You see this again and again. God gathers together. Satan, on the other hand, the devil, whose name means to scatter, is the scattering force, the dividing force. But on the Christian picture, Satan is derivative, secondary, and really a kind of unnatural violation of the way in which things naturally should be in God's good creation. They should be gathered together. That's what's going to happen when, according to what Jesus prophesied, the Son of Man comes. He'll send out his angels to the four winds and will gather together all of his elect. That's the great promise, is that there'll be a final gathering together, and then Satan will be thrown into the everlasting fire, and that will be the end of that. Now, Empedocles shares with Christianity that vision of an opposition of love and strife, but for him, this is an endless cycle. It's eternal, it always was, and it always will be. There's nothing unnatural about it. There's nothing that is going to ever fix this, so to speak. And we could put fix in air quotes, that it's not going to be ever done away with. It's a constant feature of the universe. For Nietzsche, this opposition of love and strife is the essence of the tragic, and that's why he calls Empedocles the tragic philosopher. Neither love nor strife by itself is tragic. Love by itself is just boring. This is perhaps why marriage, where there's no drama after a while for people, can get boring. Nietzsche associated this with the Apollonian. It's beautiful, but it's a kind of calm state of mind that is akin to death, really, in which one is sort of just held and transfixed by the object of love, but nothing happens. On the other hand, strife by itself is merely horrifying, which Nietzsche associated with what he called the Dionysian, which is the sort of terror that seizes you when you're thrown into a complete chaos. Strife without a counterbalance of love is just complete chaos. Empedocles' goal in life, in Nietzsche's view, was to lead humanity across the sea of strife to the shore of universal friendship. And again, we see a kind of echo of the ambition that later will come on the scene in Christianity. But apparently for Empedocles, this was always a goal that was bound to fail. And perhaps that is another feature of the tragic nature of this goal. We see the opposition to strife in several fragments. 13 through 15, for example, he says in number 13, joyless place where bloodshed, anger, and tribes of other spirits of death and squalid diseases, rotting, and works of dissolution wander in darkness through the meadow of disaster. 14. Alas, wretched race of mortals, unfortunate, out of such quarreling and groaning were you born. Human individuals are born out of strife. Remember, because strife is the dividing principle. So we're born out of strife. This is a kind of tragic irony. We're born out of strife. We wouldn't exist were it not for this metaphysical principle of strife. But yet this is what also causes hatred, anger, bloodshed, which, remember, is what leads to the endless reincarnation, this kind of samsara principle that he mentioned earlier. Number 15, will you not cease from harsh-sounding bloodshed? Do you not see that you are devouring each other in the carelessness of your thought? So there's a kind of lament, a kind of tragic lament over this dual status that strife has. On the one hand, it's what gives birth to humanity as individuals, as a race, so to speak, in the human race. On the other hand, it inevitably leads us into bloodshed and harming one another. Empedocles synthesizes many of the preceding strains of pre-Socratic philosophy. And we can catalog a few of these just to kind of keep track of them. So, we see that, like the Milesians, like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, the roots of being, as he calls them in fragment 4, are material elements. Fire, water, air, and earth, the roots. So the roots of being are material elements. And we see, therefore, a continuation of this tradition from the Milesians. Like Anaximander, differentiation and unification is the fundamental cycle. So we see him taking on this feature of Anaximander's philosophy, in which differentiation and unification is the fundamental cycle of change. Differentiation and unification of the fundamental cycle of change. And this is going to involve, as we'll see, a kind of cycle of the elements where one comes to dominate over the other. Like Heraclitus, opposition or war is a fundamental principle. Remember, we saw in Heraclitus the war is the father of all things. It's also the fundamental principle, or one of the two fundamental principles in Empedocles. War is one of the fundamental principles. And we see that the material elements are also supplemented by a spiritual or soul-like element. And in this, perhaps we can see Xenophanes, an echo of Xenophanes, his view that there's a God that's pure spirit that is responsible for governing the material elements. And we'll see something like this again in Anaxagoras, just to anticipate that. But we have mental elements that are governing the material, so that we will end up with 6. And also, these are some of the fundamental features of Empedocles' philosophy, and we can see in all of these predecessors, but he synthesizes them, the work of his predecessors, in a unique way. Now, with love and strife, obviously, these are residually anthropomorphic parts of his philosophy. You can see this characteristic in many places, but if you look at, for example, the ways they're described in the kind of second segment of number 43 on page 39, this begins down right around number 245, it says there in the margins. For as I previously said, while declaring the bounds of my words, I will tell a double story. For at one time they grew to be only one out of many, but at another they grew apart to be many out of one. Fire and water and earth and the immense height of air and deadly strife apart from them, equal in all directions, and love among them, equal in length and breadth. So we have there the 6 basic constituent elements of reality, the 4 material elements, fire and water and earth and air. And then the 2 spiritual elements, which are, he says, equally distributed among the material elements, strife and love. But then he switches to this anthropomorphic sort of description. Behold her, now he's talking about love, behold her with your mind, and do not sit with your eyes staring in amazement. She is also recognized as innate in mortal limbs. Through her they have kindly thoughts and do peaceful deeds, calling her by the appellation joy and also Aphrodite, alternative names for love. We have the personification of love in the goddess Aphrodite. No mortal man has seen her spinning among them, but listen to the undeceitful course of my account. So we see this idea that you can't grasp these principles, but we can see them sort of indirectly in our own limbs to begin with, in our own, when we embrace someone we love, for example. So there are obviously these residually anthropomorphic parts of his philosophy. And that raises a question as to how anthropomorphic we should take these principles. He associates them with humanity. Should we take them as mental principles or as conscious ones? Are they personal divinities in any sense? Or are they merely personifications of natural forces, poetic descriptions that aren't to be taken too literally? Clearly, he wants to retain the continuity between the emotional, human sense of these principles and their divine, cosmic, metaphysical sense as principles of mixing in the universe. So in the emotional, human sense, we can see, for example, him referring in number 44, where love and strife have their guiding counsels, this is very clear in the mass of mortal limbs. Sometimes we come together through love into one, all the limbs that have obtained a body at the peak of flourishing life, while at other times, split apart through evil quarrels, they wander each kind separately on the furthest shore of life. And it happens the same way for bushes and water-homed fish and mountain-dwelling beasts and wing-propelled birds. We see in our own lives light, love, and strife, and what's operating in the love and strife that we're aware of, that we can see today on every other reality TV program, is the same principle that's responsible for governing the birds and the beasts and the air and the earth and all of reality. So he's equating the emotional human sense of these principles with their divine cosmic metaphysical sense. These all come together. And in 45 too, but come, behold this witness of my previous discourse. If anything in the foregoing was feeble in form, the sun brilliant to see and hot everywhere, and all the immortal things that are drenched in the heat and shining light, and rain in all things dark and cold, and from earth streams forth things rooted and solid. In anger they are all apart. He uses anger instead of strife. They are all apart and have separate forms, but come together in love and yearn for one another. And from these, all things that were and are and will be in the future have sprouted, trees and men and women and beasts and birds and fishes, and long-lived gods. Even the gods spring from love and strife. So the sun is due to love and strife. All the immortal things, the immortal gods, and the birds and the animals. At the very least here, though, I think he wants to retain the notion that drives are at the basis of reality, drives, not merely blind mechanical forces. And what's the difference between a drive and a blind mechanical force? Well, drives are purposive. They're end or goal directed. They want something. Think of, the sex drive that drives you to seek out sexual intercourse. It's got a goal. It's not just a blind mechanical force. And love and strife are drives in that way, just as strife might lead you to the goal of taking revenge on an enemy or destroying something. So too, love has a goal. And so they're purpose directed. They're not merely blind mechanical forces. Also, it's important to note here that in addition to the way in which he follows some of the Milesians and Anaximander and Heraclitus in these principles, he also follows Parmenides. And his 6 basic metaphysical elements are in themselves, one, unchanging, eternal, and indivisible, just like Parmenides' being. They're one, unchanging, eternal, and indivisible. So even though there is this cycle they go through, in themselves, they never change. There never is more strife or less strife. It's always distributed. They're always distributed equally throughout reality. They don't come into being. They always were, and they will never go out of being. And we see this in a number of places. In in 43. He says they are always unchanging in a cycle. This is right just above 245 where I read it. He says in 260, and then facing column, still in 43, nothing is added to them or subtracted. For if they were perishing continuously, they would no longer be. Because they're unchanging. If they were always perishing, they would have gone out of existence already. That seems to be the idea. But what could increase their totality, and where would it come from? And how could it perish, since nothing is empty of these? So everything is full of these 6 elements. They don't come to be, and they don't perish. Also in 36, fools, for their thoughts are not far-reaching, those who expect that there comes to be what previously was not, or that anything perishes and is completely destroyed. You see there a kind of echo of Parmenides' argument. Something being doesn't come to be. It would have to have come to be out of nothingness, and that's impossible. And Empedocles basically repeats this idea from Parmenides, suggesting some influence of Parmenides on him. And also in 39, for it is impossible to come to be from what in no way is. It is impossible to come to be from what in no way is. That's straight Parmenides. And it is not to be accomplished, and it's unheard of that what is perishes, absolutely. For it will always be where a person thrusts it each time. His commitment to the one included the element of the identity of all human beings with one another, and also with all living creatures. For example, in 45, which I read from before, he says, for there are, this is the end of the passage, for there are just these things, and running through one another, they come to have different appearances, for mixture changes them. Remember, he was talking about the gods and the human beings and trees and beasts and birds and fishes. He's saying that these things run through each other. In other words, there's always going to be all of these different things, and they come to have different appearances as the basic elements are mixed and remixed. So there's a fundamental identity to all of these things. One aspect of the doctrine of the oneness of all living things, is a belief in reincarnation. That is, that I myself as an individual have been mixed in many different ways, or the elements of me have been mixed in many different ways and will be remixed in many different ways. Empedocles apparently believed personally that he had prior lives, including animal form. So you clearly see here again the bleeding in of Eastern religion and philosophy into the West. Empedocles himself was sympathetic to the more religious branch of the Pythagoreans, so he followed their founder in adhering to this doctrine. And we see this expressed in several fragments. He refers to mortal humans who perish many times in number 3. In number 7, he describes, as I read earlier, the evil man wandering through 10,000 seasons, through time growing to be all different kinds of mortals. And then in 11, he says, I have already been born as a boy and a girl and a bush and a bird and a mute fish from the sea, expressing a belief in reincarnation. So sympathy for him is not just a metaphysical principle, it's also an ethical principle, requiring vegetarianism, for instance. So we have this, what we might describe as the Empedoclean cycle, in which we have the one, which is a unity of elements, particular unity of elements, which of course can take different many forms, and we have the many, which is a differentiation of elements. And the principle of strife leading to the many, and the principle of love leading to the one. So this is basically the picture of the universe for Empedocles. On the one hand, because there's this constant cycling, it's in a constant state of internal change, mixing together and breaking apart again, and mixing together and breaking apart again. But if you view it just as a whole, it's the Parmenidean picture. It's completely static and unchanging. Nothing is entering into the system, and nothing is going out of the system, and the system is not in any way perishing. It just eternally, it always is this way. That's the picture that he presents to us. So there's no true creation or destruction. There's simply mixing, dissolution, and remixing. Okay, this leads to the first discussion question. Is there anything in Empedocles' philosophy that's still viable today? For example, how does it compare as a vision of the nature and significance of the universe compared to other religious and philosophical worldviews? Do you agree with Nietzsche's assessment that it is a tragic worldview? If you do not, why not? If you do you think this is a reason to accept or reject Empedocles' vision of the cosmos? So once again, first discussion question, is there anything in Empedocles' philosophy that is still viable today? How does it compare as a vision of the nature and significance of the universe compared to other religious and philosophical worldviews? Do you agree with Nietzsche's assessment that it is a tragic worldview? If you do not, why not? If you do you think this is a reason to accept or reject Empedocles' vision of the cosmos? All right, so that brings us to Anaxagoras, the second philosopher we're going to be looking at in this video. He is from Clazomenae in Asia Minor, but became notable as the first of the pre-Socratics to operate in Athens. His view that the sun and stars are fiery stones and that none is a god led to his reputation for atheism, which cast a shadow over philosophy in Athens and helped to contribute to Socrates' condemnation. He's mentioned in the Apology. It might be best to think of Anaxagoras as attempting to carry on the Milesian materialistic reductionistic program. So remember, this is what we're talking about, the Milesians. What we might describe as Milesian materialism and reductionism, attempting to reduce all of the manifold phenomena to one basic material principle like water or air. That's Milesian materialism, reductionism. That's what I'm referring to here. We can see Anaxagoras is attempting to reconcile this with Parmenidean rationalism, as we might describe it, which demanded a logically consistent account of being. So we have these purely rational, logical, abstract arguments in Parmenides that said that being has to be one, indivisible, unchanging. And this, of course, seems to be contrary to common sense and to the testimony of our senses, which tells us that the things are many and changing and divisible and things perish and so on. So how does Anaxagoras fit into this? The suggestion I'm making here is that Anaxagoras is attempting to reconcile Milesian materialism with Parmenidean rationalism, to bring these two principles together, which seem to be opposed to one another. This is the interpretive framework I would suggest is a fruitful one to use to look at what Anaxagoras is up to here. So Parmenides' view, even though it had powerful and difficult to refute arguments in its favor, led to a completely abstract metaphysical theory that's useless for scientific explanations of natural phenomena, of change and becoming. Yet at the same time, it has the advantage over Milesian rationalism in that it's more logically rigorous. Anaxagoras accepts the strength of Parmenides' logical arguments, but he still wants to construct natural scientific explanations. So we can see that Anaxagoras accepts Parmenidean principles. For example, first of all, that everything is present in everything. Everything is present in everything. We see that in number 24. This is on page 50. Reading from Aristotle. Anaxagoras probably supposed the principles to be unlimited in this way because he accepted as true the common opinion of the physicists that nothing comes to be from what is not. Interesting here, it's noteworthy here that by the time we get to Aristotle, the Parmenidean view has become the common opinion of the physicists. By physicists here, he means basically the philosophers of nature, those philosophers who are focused on giving this kind of account of the nature of nature that we see in basically all the pre-Socratics. But after Parmenides, with Empedocles and Anaxagoras and the other philosophers to follow, he's saying becomes the common opinion that nothing comes to be from what is not. That is why they say all things were together, and why Anaxagoras makes the generation of a thing of a certain sort into alteration. There's no true generation because being always was. What we think of as generation is merely a certain sort of alteration of the fundamental underlying stuff. Everything is always present in everything. I made a mistake there. I read for the next principle I wanted to say, no thing comes into being or passes away. Okay, so I have these two principles, and I read the evidence for the second one. No thing comes into being or passes away. Now, I slipped there from where I was supposed to be looking. What about everything is present in everything? Here, we go back to number 4 in the first line. He says, it is right to think that there are many different things present in everything that is being combined, in seeds of all things, having all sorts of forms, colors, and flavors, and that humans and also other animals were compounded, as many as have soul. And also number 6, since the shares of the large and the small are equal in number, in this way too all things will be in everything. Nor is it possible that anything be separate, but all things have a share of everything. There we see this first principle. Everything is present in everything. And then also the second one, no thing comes into being or passes away. These are two Parmenidean principles that Anaxagoras also argues for, or accepts, I guess you could say. The first principle here, that everything is present in everything, also implies something else, that nothing really changes into something else, that it already has the ingredients within it. So we can add this as another consequence. In a sense, nothing really changes, but with the qualification into something else, because it already had the ingredients in it. So, like Parmenides, he holds the view that nothing really ever changes, but what that means more strictly for Anaxagoras is that nothing really changes into something else because it already had the ingredients within it. And second, apparent generation and destruction are just remixing of ingredients. Apparent generation and destruction are just remixing of ingredients. So these are the 4, I would say, Parmenidean principles that he holds. And on this last one, if you look at the second half of paragraph 6, or fragment 6, since it is not possible that there is a least, it would not be possible that anything be separated nor come to be by itself. But just as in the beginning, now too all things are together. In all things there are many things present, equal in number, both in the greater and in the lesser of things being separated off. So it's kind of an odd view from a modern sensibility, as many of these are, but the idea is that everyone contains the same equal number of ingredients, and these are just rearranged in different ways, and that's what gives us this illusion of change, but it's not real change. It's just a kind of remixing of ingredients. And similarly, when something comes into being or goes out of being, apparently, what's going on is, again, just a remixing of the ingredients, but now of the larger world, of the larger material universe. So this notion of an original cosmic mixture, this is really characteristic of Anaxagoras' metaphysics. In number 1, he says, all things were together unlimited in both amount and in smallness, for the small too was unlimited. And because all things were together, nothing was evident on account of smallness. For air and ether dominated all things, both being unlimited, for these are the greatest among all things, both in amount and in largeness. And we see an important word here, the unlimited. Remember Anaximander's notion of the apeiron, or the unlimited, which is translated as the unlimited. We see that Anaxagoras takes this notion on here, referring to an unlimited. And this becomes Anaxagoras' cosmic mixture, the primordial cosmic mixture of all things. When all things were together in the cosmic mixture in an unlimited way. Recall that one problem with Anaximander's notion was its wholly indeterminate or indefinite character. It seemed too obscure. That was a problem. What is this unlimited? With Anaxagoras, we have a more specific version of this notion of an unlimited origin of all material reality. Namely, with him, it's a primordial mixture of all qualities in which none is yet differentiated from any other. The indeterminate and indefinite and obscure Anaximandrian notion of the apeiron as the unlimited becomes the more particular notion of the cosmic mixture of all qualities in which none is yet differentiated from any other. So we have a little bit of philosophical or scientific progress here, arguably. And we see this described in number 4, where he says, it is right to think that there are many different things present in everything, that being combined, and seeds of all things, that is being combined rather, and seeds of all things, having all sorts of forms and colors and flavors, and that humans and also other animals were compounded, as many have soul. And then skipping down to the bottom there, last 8 lines or so. Before there was separation off, because all things were together, there was not even any color evident, for the mixture of all things prevented it, and of the wet and the dry, and the hot and the cold, and the bright and the dark. And there was as much earth present and seeds, unlimited in number, in no way similar to one another. So what he's saying is that in this original cosmic mixture, all the qualities were together. And because they were all together, none was able to be discriminated from one another, but yet they were all really there. So this can explain, as Anaximander could not, where the qualities of material things such as hot and cold come from. Remember, Anaximander simply has to posit that something that is the cause of hot and cold emerges out of the unlimited or the infinite or indefinite, but he couldn't explain how this is possible. And so Anaximander is trying to give the explanation. He's saying that the limitless is really the mixture, the absolute mixture of absolutely all the qualities together, the seeds of everything, as he describes it. And these things, when they're mixed, cannot be differentiated, but they really are there as hot and cold and wet and dry, etc., 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 and all the colors and so forth. And so then these things can come apart. Of course, we need an account of how they come apart, and that's also what Anaxagoras is going to go on to provide us. The suggestion that reality is a mixture in which originally undifferentiated qualities are mixed and remixed naturally raises the question of the process or processes by which this mixing and remixing occurs. And we get some description of Anaxagoras' views on this from Aristotle. So on 25, he says, Anaxagoras, in the middle of the segment, claims that the homogenous stuffs are the elements. I mean, for instance, flesh and bone, and each of the things of that sort. And that air and fire are mixtures of them and of all the other seeds, for each of them is a collection of the invisible homogenous stuffs. 26. Anaxagoras makes the homogeneous stuffs elements, for instance, bone and flesh and marrow, and the others of which each part is called by the name as the whole. So we saw that Empedocles had a similar notion, and he explains the remixing by appeal to the principles of love and strife. What Anaxagoras says is that there are these homogeneous seeds, and they come to be mixed in such a way that they come to form other things. But he doesn't account for this by love and strife. But by contrast to Empedocles, Anaxagoras suggests a mechanical conception. So the key idea here is that there's a kind of revolution that leads to separation and a process of remixing. So this idea of revolution is how he accounts for the process whereby the original cosmic mixture, which corresponds to Anaximander's limitlessness, unlimited, comes to be separate individuals. In fragment 9, he says, as these things are revolving in this way and being separated off by force and swiftness, the swiftness produces force, and their swiftness resembles the swiftness of nothing that is now present among humans, but is altogether many times as fast. So this picture of a kind of cosmic centrifuge that's spinning these things off. Again in 15, and the dense and the wet and the cold and the dark came together here, where earth is now, but the rare and the hot and the dry moved out to the far reaches of the ether. There is a quite clearly mechanical conception. It seems like he's suggesting that there's this spinning of the cosmic mixture that flings all of the separate elements out. But what that does is make the heavier elements sort of settle closer together, and then the lighter elements, like the air and the ether, are flung farther away. However, Anaxagoras also gives a prominent role to mind or nous in this picture. Nous, which is mind in Greek, is somehow responsible for this revolution. There's an echo of Xenophanes here, suggesting that there's a ruling spirit or mind as a ruling power that provides intelligent direction to the process of nature. The original state of the cosmos was one in which all things were mixed together except for nous. He's quite clear about this, that nous was pure and unmixed. In 11, he says, in everything there's a share of everything. Everything is mixed together with everything except nous. But there are some things in which nous too is present. Presumably that could be human beings, for example. The other things have a share of everything, but nous is, this is continuing on to 12 now. The other things have a share of everything, but nous is unlimited and self-ruling and has been mixed with no thing. So as required by Parmenides, nous itself is ungenerated and unlimited. He says in 14, nous which always is. Nous is always, is unchanging, ungenerated, and unlimited. It's not part of the original mixture, so at the most fundamental level, Anaxagoras affirms both the many and the one, the many seeds that are mixed together and the one nous. that's a separate. So there is a kind of ultimate metaphysical pluralism, I think, in Anaxagoras, because nous is this separate principle. But it is necessary. It's not an arbitrary add-on. It's necessary for the control of things. That's where it comes in, is sort of the governing control over this revolution, operating the cosmic centrifuge, you might say. And this is the reason why it can't be mixed in with everything. In the center of number 12, he says, and nous has control over all things that have soul, both the larger and the smaller. And nous controlled the whole revolution so that it started to revolve in the beginning. And he talks about this revolution growing and growing as nous ordered it. And then the revolution caused the things to separate off. So it's not. There's a hint of a kind of deism here, suggesting that maybe nous started the revolution, but then let it go on its own. So it's a combination of a kind of deism with a basically mechanical view of how separation takes place in the universe. It's a little bit obscure what nous involves internally. It seems to have the property or quality or attribute of intelligence, but it's unclear whether it is an intelligence, that is, an actual personal mind or soul. Look at the way Aristotle describes it, apparently characterizing Anaxagoras' position in number 27. This is a kind of a famous line. When someone said that nous is present in nature just as in animals, as the cause of the cosmos in all its order, he appeared as a sober man among the random chatterers who preceded him. We know that Anaxagoras clearly held these views, but Hermotimus of Clazomenae gets the credit for holding them earlier. So there's someone in Anaxagoras' hometown who apparently held this view that nous is present in all things. But to say it's present in all things, I mean, it's not clear that this implies that it's like a world soul or a world mind, or that this implies some kind of panpsychism. Nous seems actually like something closer to Heraclitus' logos, the very principle of reason or intellect itself, considered as the arche or the principle of the cosmos, not a personal mind. So that wouldn't necessarily imply a panpsychism or the belief in a world soul. How much involvement does this nous have in the day-to-day operations of nature? How much active involvement does it have? In comparison to Empedocles, Anaxagoras seems to have preferred to minimize reliance on any purposive or end-directed principle. We can't understand Empedocles' love and strife except as drives, as purpose-directed forces. They may not be minds or gods in the traditional sense, but they share the feature of having a kind of foresight into the end goal or end of their activity. In this, love and strife are opposed to purely mechanical causes. By contrast, Anaxagoras seems to have favored something closer to Xenophanes' conception of a somewhat detached machine operator or even a machine supervisor intelligence that mostly leaves the machine to run itself through mechanical processes that are blind and that are not end directed, or so it seems. Okay, this leads to our second discussion question. Would you agree that Anaxagoras is attempting to reconcile the Milesian materialistic reductionistic program with the Parmenidean rationalistic demands for a logically consistent conception of being? Remember, this is the way I was originally set it up, that Anaxagoras can be best understood as attempting to bring together Milesian materialism with Parmenidean rationalism. How, if at all, does Anaxagoras improve upon the theories of such earlier philosophers as Anaximander, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Xenophanes? So once again, second discussion question. Would you agree that Anaxagoras is attempting to reconcile the Milesian materialistic reductionistic program with the Parmenidean rationalistic demands for a logically consistent conception of being? How, if at all, does Anaxagoras improve upon the theories of such earlier philosophers as Anaximander, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Xenophanes.